begin by thanking Dr. Bansal, Mr. Bansal, for the very kind invitation to address NDIM and the 20th batch of MBAs this morning. And let me also greet the other distinguished guests here, Ambassador Goel and other dignitaries that have come this morning for this presentation that I would like to give to you is really, as the title of this presentation reads, Perspectives on Brazil and India. These are two countries that are increasingly emerging in the international scene, and a number of issues, I think, come up because of their impact in the international sphere. But let's begin by some considerations on my own country, Brazil. Some basic information on Brazil. It's the largest South American country, as you know. It's the fifth country in the world in extension, 8.5 million square kilometers, population that is approaching 200 million. It has several large cities. The largest one is São Paulo. It's around 12 million inhabitants. Then you have Rio de Janeiro, about half that, and several other cities above, 17 cities actually above 1 million, including the capital, Brasilia. This, by South American standards, is a very populous country. Of course, in this part of the world, the standards are different in this respect. Brazil is a very rich country in natural resources. It has 12% of the Earth's freshwater reserves, and there you have a picture of the Amazon rainforest. 77% of its electricity comes from hydropower, and another around 12% from renewable energy, which gives Brazil a very clean energy matrix. That's because of the way that Brazil has been able to harness its hydropower so far. It is also a very large iron ore producer, the world's second. It has the second largest reserve, and it's becoming a large oil producer as well. Brazil began as an importing country of oil, and as time went by, it made some important discoveries offshore, and even more recently, even greater discoveries, always offshore, very deep, very expensive investment. But this has allowed Brazil to become self-sufficient in oil, around 2 million barrels per day. That's more or less the Brazilian production. This is set to increase as these new wells become operational. Natural gas is also an important asset for Brazil, and it is a major agricultural producer for the world. The economic data for Brazil gives it GDP of around 2.5 trillion, and that's about 3 trillion on purchasing power parity, according to the World Bank. That's its seventh largest economy, even though, of course, depending on the specific statistics that you get, this may vary a little bit, but still, that puts Brazil within the 10 largest economies in the world. GDP per capita of around $12,000, and GDP growth has been slowing in the last few years, including this one. May even fall below 0%, but we think that this is something that will be superseded soon. The greater part of Brazil's GDP comes from services, about 67%, and then industrial production as well, and finally agricultural production, which puts Brazil around at 95 billion exports, which is really what a mainstay for the Brazilian economy. Now, there have been some very significant social economic improvements in the past 8 or 10, 15 years in Brazil. First, the GDP has grown, even though with fluctuations, but on average between 4 and 5%, and this has increased the Brazilian standard of living it has been more, this growth has been more evenly distributed than before in the Brazilian population, and Brazil has also benefited a lot from this, from the commodity boom that characterized most of the past decade. So the combination of a higher growth with expansion of foreign direct investments in Brazil and also public programs of investment has led to decreasing rates of unemployment in the country. So Brazil's economy became almost fully employed within certain limits. And this has resulted in an important reduction of inequality, which still marks very much Brazilian society. Now, this was done mainly through the expansion of the internal market, much like what we see in this country too. There has been a very large increase in the internal market, and more people have had much more access to the produced goods of the country itself. So this growth has been in part led by the expansion of the internal market, and we'll see some of the consequences of that. Very recent political developments have been the re-election of Brazil's president, Dilma Rousseff. She's in her second mandate. This was in October last year. She was re-elected for a second four-year term. She began the new term in January, and as she began her new term, she had to implement some economic measures that seek to correct some of the distortions that have been engendered in the Brazilian economy because of that fairly rapid growth that the country has experienced. Now, she was sworn in January in 2015, and she immediately had to implement certain economic adjustment measures. This is the finance minister, Mr. Levy. He is putting forward a major reorientation of the Brazilian economy, partly because this commodity boom has exhausted itself, partly because the expenditure and the fiscal deficit by the Brazilian government was running too high, and there was a need to control that, to rein that in. The main objectives are to ensure competitiveness for Brazilian industry, to protect the social gains, to consolidate a new middle class which has emerged in Brazil very, very strongly, to reduce the regional disparities that exist within the country. It's a very big country too, and to better distribute purchasing power growth. These are the main objectives of these measures that are being put into place in Brazil. Now, these amount to essentially rationalization of government spending, government cuts in spending, a reduction of subsidies to end tax breaks that had been put in place to avoid some of the effects of the slowdown in the international economy in Brazil, and revised rates for some taxes, so some increase in tax rates, higher taxes on imports, financial operations, higher corporate contributions to social programs, meaning that the government will spend less on social programs and pass part of this burden to the private sector. These adjustments are sort of also imply a reform of access to social benefits, such as unemployment insurance, pensions, benefit to specific categories, and a projection of government expenditures using 2013 numbers and smaller monthly installments to ensure gains in a way that the government expenditure will seek to be more efficient. There is a reform also of federal and state taxation to streamline and harmonize tax collection. In Brazil is partly decentralized in the sense that you have federal taxes, you have state taxes, you have municipal taxes, and all these sometimes add to a very big burden. And a new task force to try to rein in and implement Brazilian government expenditure. That's important in terms of keeping the fiscal deficit within certain limits, and particularly to reduce that deficit and to in the next few years to transform it into an actual surplus. So these measures, of course, they have had an economic impact. They aim at these objectives that I put forward: the increase in productivity, more participation in international trade, in capital markets, increase in private sector participation through major new concessions of public works, and renewed concession for contracts, in particular for power companies. Brazil is going to experience a big surge in the demand for power in the coming years, and the government will let private investors take a part of that market share. So the medium to long-term objectives of these measures are to achieve greater efficiency in infrastructure and logistics services, especially in agriculture, opening of new domestic markets, education and innovation, ensuring sustainable national production, and geographic decentralization of investments. Other medium to long-term objectives mean that the fiscal balance in Brazil will be maintained, and the inflation target will also remain within certain limits. It's 4.5%, relatively low inflation rate if we take the standards of developing countries. A reduction of the interest rates, and jobs and income growth improvement as a means of sustaining the social well-being that has been achieved in Brazil over the past 10, 15 years that we talked about. Now, the role of the government and the private sector, I think, is being reconsidered in Brazil, and the emphasis on the private sector, I think, is very, very, very strong now in Brazil. A statement by the finance minister himself stresses that. He says that the role of the government is not to choose the script or the main actor. It's not supposed to pay for production. But the private sector will have to choose the script, and the private sector will be the main driver of this process of economic growth. But he also recognizes that before things